Welcome to Forging Plowshares, a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom of God. We hope this part of our ongoing conversation stimulates your mind and challenges your heart about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Please stay tuned at the end of the podcast for a short message about our ministry.
This is Paul Axton, Director of Forging Plowshares and Plowshares Bible Institute, and in this continuation of the discussion in sin and salvation, we take up the person and work of David Karl and Ivan Illich. Karl is the person who is really responsible, the keeper of the work of Ivan Illich, who was a Catholic priest who lived from 1926 to 2002. He is the key critic, really, of Catholicism and modern Christianity, though he always was a Catholic priest. But he describes the apocalyptic or world-changing ideas inaugurated by Christianity and how it is that the corruption of the best, this is kind of a saying of his, and he means by the best, New Testament Christianity, is the worst. And by this he means modern Western society. And in discussing or introducing the work of Ivan Illich, we actually first turn to the work of the black theologian James Cone and the author James Baldwin are really a kind of example. I use these examples as an entry into the work of Karl, in which each then describes the kind of degradation of modern society and the modern church in its continuation of the black-white divide. That is, that here is an example of what he means by the worst in modern society and the perversion of New Testament Christianity. And so Illich, in the spirit of Kierkegaard, pictures Christianity as potentially unleashing a power for evil, first in its revolutionary remaking of the world for the good, in freedom from law and the opening to the personal, which he focuses on, and then in the transformation of this highest good into the worst, the lonely fear of hell and suffering under the law of conscience. Apocalyptic, which is not the word that he employs, I think captures the unmaking of the world in both its recreative and destructive phases, which also describes the deep insight of Illich's work. Forging Plowshares is a non-profit ministry, and we greatly appreciate your donations, which allow us to continue our ministry of Forging Plowshares and Plowshares Bible Institute. We do have an upcoming class with Ethan Vanderleek. The class is Do Not Let Your Hearts Be Troubled, Perspectives on Peace. The course starts April 8th and it will run through May 27th, and it will meet from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Central Time on Wednesday evenings. For those of you who cannot make that time, Ethan and I have agreed that we will meet up with those of you who would like to hear the recording of the class. That is, we'll record each class, and you can watch the recording of the lecture, and then we can meet up with you if you're not able to make that time. So this class with Ethan, it examines peace from various perspectives: biblical, theological, philosophical, and interreligious. And Ethan is a student of William Desmond. He's going to employ 3 of Desmond's works in the class. We won't read the whole books. We're reading sections. Or actually, we're going to read the book Sabbath by Abraham Heschel. We'll read Cultural Disarmament, The Way to Peace by Raymond Paniker. And we'll read The Truce of God by Rowan Williams. We'll read Walter Brueggemann, Living Toward a Vision Shalom as freedom and unity. We'll read Thomas Merton, The Root of War is Fear. We're going to take up various historical perspectives of Augustine, Julian of Norwich, and from an Islamic perspective, Sayyid Hossein Nasr, Compassion and Love, Peace and Beauty in the Heart of Islam. If you would like to sign up for this class, you can do so. Enrollment is now open. Just go to Plowshares Bible Institute course offerings, and you can enroll in the class. If you've never filled out an application to Forging Plowshares, please do so. And upon receipt of your application, we will send you the acceptance, and then you can enroll in the class. The cost for the course is $150. And this course we're seeing as a kind of introduction, of getting ready for the work with the class with William Desmond. William Desmond is going to conduct a course over his own work and will cover key issues in his philosophy and work. And so we see the two courses going together, and Ethan's course is certainly more than a preparation for Desmond, but it will hopefully also serve that purpose. Donations can be made on the Outreach International website, oionline.org, through PayPal or Simple Give. Our project number is FP3901. Just select our project number when donating. But hope you benefit then from this conversation on Ivan Illich. Do you all know who James Baldwin is?
I've heard the name.
So
the author?
Yeah, the author.
Yeah.
So maybe to, in the Bible we have Jew, Gentile, but maybe it would be just in our context to talk about white and black. Maybe in our, for the Jews, and it was the Jew, Gentile that grounded this symbolic order. The way that I think black-white kind of just grounds a similar symbolic order in the United States.
Yeah.
James Baldwin says, I was able to see, his father was a preacher. I was able to see that the principles governing the rites and customs of the churches in which I grew up did not differ from the principles governing the rites and customs of other churches, white. His point is, and my point is, the law, the punishing law, white against black, is still in place. He says, I would love to believe that the principles were faith, hope, and charity. But this is clearly not so for most Christians, or what we would call the Christian world. And so he describes a Christianity that has operated, he says, with an unmitigated arrogance and cruelty, as it has identified itself with the realm of power. And so the dominance of the value system of the ruling culture, I think, emptied the gospel for Baldwin of its meaning. We almost have to understand the power of this thing, of Jew, Gentile, maybe in our context, black, white. Baldwin, of course, rejected. He talks a lot about Christianity, but ultimately rejected. But James Cone is a black author. Are you familiar with James Cone? He's written The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
Yeah. I just want to say one quick thing, Paul, that is probably a good reminder, especially in the context of what you were writing about in this chapter. It's like, I think a lot of times what people reject is a closed world system version of Christianity that is not, so it's not a rejection of Christ because they have never known Christ, because the Christianity they presented with never presented Christ to them. So that apocalyptic understanding never occurred for them.
If it doesn't explode Jew, Gentile, if it doesn't explode black, white, if it doesn't explode male, female, if it doesn't explode slave, free, as categories of identity, we're not doing Christianity. And of course, that's the problem with the church as we have it, that we're still subject in some way. And so the dominating powers, I think we get a feel for, we're all subject to this thing. We're all inundated by this thing. James Cone comes to, I think, was also then saw the reality of the treatment of black people and describes the anger that he had, that in black oppression. But then he comes to a kind of resolution. He says, the more I read about and looked at whites did to powerless blacks, the angrier I became. Paradoxically, anger soon gave way to a profound feeling of liberation. The countless acts of violence enacted on black bodies in lynching and murder, in Cone's description, it brought him to a choice. He says, either God is identified with the oppressed to the point that their experience becomes God's experience, or God is a God of racism. Either we identify with the one who is on the cross, or we identify with those who put him on the cross. Either we identify with the one who is on the lynching tree, which is all a cross is, or we identify with those who are doing the lynching. Cone says that God is known where human beings experience humiliation and suffering. I think in an apocalyptic theology, that part of what is happening, we can fully acknowledge the oppression of the system. And then we get at the reality, the necessity that we have for the system to be broken open.
One moment though, as Gerard pointed out, though, even that can be weaponized and turned into a system. Even that realization itself can.
You can, you can recognize scapegoating and take up scapegoating, as our vice president would have us do.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, these good Christians, Gerardian Christians, I'm a little fearful of some of them because I'm afraid what Peter Thiel, what J.D. Vance are advocating is not the insight of being liberated from scapegoating, but the insight of employing scapegoating as a manipulative tool in finance and politics.
I'm a little less concerned about Thiel, who's interesting and complicated, but I definitely am very cynical about J.D. Vance.
Yeah, I can't claim to know a lot about Thiel other than he seems to be
he's just the money font for he's the money font for a lot of Girardians across the political spectrum, though, to be fair.
So yeah, just to say, and by the way, I would go ahead and criticize both. I think the Cone, the danger in even in somebody like James Cone, who I think we almost need to read the Cross of the Lynching Tree, is that there is then the danger of turning around and reifying blackness and whiteness. You can almost
and also victim and oppressor.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that's the more dangerous one, because it doesn't recognize the reality that Christ is pointing to is that we are all oppressed by this system that we have created. And to divide it into a simple narrative about victims and oppressors is actually doing the same thing.
Yeah.
With a different duality.
Are you familiar with the term homo sacer? This is actually Agamben has done a lot with homo sacer. The homo sacer is the one excluded from humanity. He's stripped. In other words, somebody that's homo sacer is stripped of any legal status and falls outside the political community and is, the people that could be crucified were homo sacer. They weren't included in the law. And the power of death, or deciding who, dies outside the city, is actually in Agamben's point of view, but I think this is what the New Testament is exposing, that those who have the power of exclusion are those who found the city, the rule and the rulers of the city. And of course, this obviously describes those who killed Christ and the fact that he's homo sacer. He dies outside the city of man, beyond law, beyond religion, and he's reduced on the cross to just, he's not even human in a sense. He's just a biological life. But of course, Christ, as the exception, exposes the basis upon which exclusion and universality are constructed. The subject dependent upon the law, dependent upon the city of man, requires homo sacer. The lynched, the crucified, the erased, as this violence secures his identity. I'm not doing Girard, but this is certainly reflective of Girard. The great danger is that we would be confused with the scapegoat, that we would be confused with the one on the cross, that we would be confused with the one on the lynching tree. And of course, the whole point of Christianity is that we identify with Christ, we take up our crosses, we take up our lynching trees, if you will, that we identify with the homo sacer, the one that would be excluded, because the power of the city, the principalities and powers of the city, depend then upon this exclusion. This is getting at Paul's description then in Galatians of the breaking down of the wall of hostility, which constitutes the subject of humanity. Paul is describing not simply Jew and Gentile. I think in Galatians when he says the wall of hostility has been broken down. He's describing this wall in the temple, but of course, in a metaphorical sense, it is this violent wall of exclusion and inclusion. And so the violent subject exposed by the cross, I think this is psychological, it's an anthropological, it's an epistemological insight. Kierkegaard asks it this way. He says, do we learn this truth of Christ if we are constituted a learning subject prior to the founding of subjectivity? This is sort of your point. Are we true subjects? If we're true subjects in Christ, that we only come to this subjectivity, to this realization. That is, the truth determines the form of reason. The truth, Kierkegaard concludes, is in relation to God. This is in his book on despair. The truth is constituted, he says, in the whole relation. And falsehood, the sickness unto death, the violence of the subject, this was in my last chapter actually, is to imagine that the one who relates would found the relation within himself. That is, Kierkegaard, he does this kind of ad nauseum, that the subject is the one who relates to the subject and the subject. And of course, what he's describing is this angst. And he turns from this and talks about, well, actually, it depends upon the one who founds the relation. And so that's kind of the idea here, that reason as we have it depends upon the law of sin and death. It depends upon the wall of hostility. It depends upon the lynching tree. It depends upon the excluded. It depends upon the binaries. And so when we're talking apocalyptic, we're talking about an overturning of a frame of understanding that is universal.
I would say one more thing I wanted to say that I think is an important clarification is that it locates, because the kind of truth that it's talking about is the truth that Christ points out when he says, I am the truth, then it's the kind of truth that we're talking about is not a truth that is contained in propositions. So it is possible for people to be participating in Christ completely unawares without having the correct propositions.
Yeah. That Christ fills all things that we he himself pictures that if you've done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me. Right. The alternative to what I'm describing is, of course, something we might call it a covenantal nomism, the idea that the law is primary. In most evangelicalism, most of Christianity, that it is in some way some form of covenantal nomism, a kind of contractual understanding. The law, the cosmos, the old order, then provides an entry even into the new order. Paul, I think, is saying we have no ground left to stand on. And this is Galatians, it's Romans, but especially Galatians. And what Paul is dealing with is a false gospel that would imagine we have to be Jewish in order to be Christian, that we have to do the law, that we have to understand Christ in and through the law, the Old Testament in our language. And so this is what we mean by covenantal nomism, that Christ met the requirements of the law, so righteousness has been obtained on the basis of keeping covenant through the law. This is the common understanding that ironically is precisely that which I think Paul is opposing. It's a kind of partial gospel, and Paul just is saying, no, that the world order, this malevolent world order is finished, that Christ has liberated from slavery through the cross. If you want to think of this in Girardian terms, if you want to think of it in terms of, James Cone, the cross and the lynching tree, if you want to think of it in terms of homo sacer, the lie, of course, is that and in a lie we don't fully understand what we're doing. We don't completely understand that we need the homo sacer. We need the outside of the city in order to found the inside of the city. But the lie, and this is what I mean, the lie is displaced by the truth in an apocalyptic gospel. By the cross, Paul says, the cosmos has been crucified to me, and I have been crucified to the cosmos. Circumcision is nothing, Jewishness is nothing, Gentileness is nothing, gender is nothing, ethnicity is nothing, philosophy is nothing, as what is taking its place on the order of creation from nothing. But the nothing is exposed in the light of the new creation. Paul says, for neither is circumcision anything, nor is uncircumcision anything. What is something is the new creation.
It sounds like nihilism.
I think it is, in one sense, it is the recognition that the world that most people live in is built upon nothing. They've made an absolute nothing something. And so, yes, I think Christianity recognizes the strength of nihilism. Not that it's nihilistic, but that it recognizes the power of the nothing. Paul says the idol is nothing, but then he goes on to describe its power. And of course, this is the thing. The reified idol is the problem. That we always make nothing into an absolute something.
Is that the definition of nihilism?
I think that's a good definition. But nihilism, nihilism, a true philosophical nihilism is just saying that's all there is. Most people are not. I sometimes wonder if Slavoj Žižek is not an overt nihilist. I don't think he would like that, but sometimes I think he is. Nietzsche, of course, is not a nihilist. We often call Nietzsche a nihilist, but Nietzsche is recognizing nihilism, but then saying, well, nihilism frees us up to create, to be the Superman and to create our own alternative understanding. Yeah, so I think you're right, Karl. It's the recognition that most people, and of course, nihilism, as we usually talk about it, is a conscious nihilism.
Well, the Nietzschean position is still nihilism, though, because what it is it's just substituting empty power toward nothing and empty desire toward nothing. It doesn't put any real something in the place of the nothing. And like Nietzsche's freedom is still a freedom toward nothing.
Yeah, I think you're right. Although Nietzsche himself would.
Oh, I know. I
Yeah,
know he would not agree, but
yeah,
how did it end for him?
yeah. He,
Yeah.
I see it as it drove him crazy, because he's human and he has human tenderness. He has human empathy. He actually had deep friendships, and so yeah, I think that his mind snaps at
Well,
some.
and deep jealousies. He had a very, very strange relationship with Wagner, and
And his
that
wife.
was tainted with jealousy over a woman.
Yeah, yeah. You all, even Illich, if you'll be patient with me, I'd like to talk a little about Ivan Illich.
That the life of Ivan
No,
Illich?
not. This is a Catholic priest who lived from 1926 to 2002.
Okay.
Yeah.
And even though he's Catholic, he's a severe critic of Catholicism and actually of modern Christianity. And even though this is not Illich's word, as I was reading Ivan Illich, I thought that his is a good description of apocalypticism in its double meaning. He describes the world-changing ideas inaugurated by Christianity. And then, though, and this is what Kierkegaard talked about, but actually many people have talked about this, that Kierkegaard talked about that there is the potential that with Christianity gone bad, that the good, the very best made bad is the very worst. And this is descriptive of Illich's entire work. In other words, he's saying that in Christianity, in the New Testament, we have then the revelation of the very best, and the corruption of this best is the worst. And he's equating modern Western society with perverted or corrupted Christianity. That there's a kind of unleashing of this is actually the way Gerard began to talk at the end of his life. That, actually scapegoating and recognition of the scapegoating mechanism, once you understand how this thing works, and it no longer functions to work effectively because part of the scapegoating mechanism, you have to be deceived by the scapegoat, by the sacrificial violence. And he was afraid that if there is no channeling of the violence, that this in fact would unleash violence.
So you get a zombie apocalypse.
He literally thought that we may be bringing on the apocalypse.
A zombie apocalypse.
Say
Zombie apocalypse.
Oh, maybe, yes. Yes.
Did Nietzsche also hold that as a possibility? Without,
You mean
if God is dead, there's no boundaries to human.
Nietzsche tried to paint the God is dead in a good light.
He also is about the only thinker ever who tried to paint eternal recursion in a good light. He thought the closed world was a good thing. He defended it.
Yeah, the eternal recurrence of the same. And we have to get back to that. And of course, that what he's recognizing is Christianity has actually broken that open. What Illich is describing is that one of the things Christianity has unleashed is the power of freedom from the law. We've been talking about the law then in terms of the cosmic order, and that we've displaced law with the personal, and of course personal with the big P, that Christ is personal, but also the personal of the other, that we can see Christ in the face of our neighbor, in the face of our friends, and even in the face of our enemies. And so there is this unleashing of a new recognition in Christianity that Illich is going to depict then the institutionalization of Christianity as the undoing of this personal realization and recognition. And so I'm using the word apocalyptic to capture the movement of Illich's work. He'll use it a little bit, but I don't think he would have described his whole work this way. He talked about, his early work. He wrote a series of books on talking about how schools inhibit learning, how hospitals threaten health, how prisons aggravate crime. And what he's describing in each case is that the professionalization or the institutionalization creates a kind of buffer in which taking out the direct meeting by one human of another human of their needs. I describe this in terms of a kind of symbolic order rather than a direct personal experience. But then, toward the end of his life, he conducted a series of interviews, and as far as I know, he never wrote this out, in which he fills this out in two areas. He talks about Jesus' introduction of love and the focus on the personal, and he defines sin then. He's saying that sin is a new concept in the New Testament, in which sin is the betrayal of the person. In other words, if you think in terms of Judas betraying Christ, but the betrayal of Christ or personal betrayal. But then he describes the perversion of this freedom by church, and of course he's going to talk about the church as the impetus to modern Western society, creates a new interior legalism. And he's talking here about the modern individual, and he's talking about the modern nation state. The church, he says, would transform itself into what a later church council called a perfect society, an independent, legally constituted, bureaucratically organized state exercising a dominion of an entirely new kind over the lives of the faithful. Paul Kennedy is one of those who's helped put out this recording. And he says the modern West is the result, in Illich's understanding, of the Roman Church's institutionalization of the Christian gospel, not only in education, health services, and economics, but even in relationships or lack thereof. And so Illich is a historian, and he's going to trace this historically. And so step one in Illich's picture is the impact of the incarnation, that suddenly the personal, the incarnation loads depth and weight onto the human condition, God in the flesh, divinizing relationship and friendship, and displacing then what we've been describing as this closed cosmic order, the cosmos in John. He says, Illich says, I therefore believe that the incarnation, the ensarkosis, the Greek word for the enfleshment of the biblical, Quranic, the Christian Allah, represents a turning point in looking at what happens in the world. And so I don't know if you've been in traditional societies, I talked about in Japan. How do you be in Japan? Well, you be a good mother, you be a good son, you be a good wife, you be a good student. And this is the way you're a good person. That the we Japanese is the continual refrain. And of course, how do you break out of that? I think modern society, in a sense, has broken out of that. In and through Illich's description, the incarnation suspends the defining structure, replacing the formal with the personal. That is, the I defined by the we simply makes the individual a particular instance of the corporate. And the law is displacing a direct relationship. I think this is obviously the subject of the New Testament. That Christ is freeing us from Jew, Gentile identity, male, female identity, slave-free identity, tribal identity, ethnic identity. The term ethics comes from ethnos. He's freeing us from customs, and he's replacing the impersonal, which binds us, as human beings, with love. and what we mean by love is this embodied, fleshly, relational, human, divine interaction. Illich says, if I rightly understand the point of the gospel, it's crucifixion. That is, Jesus as our Savior and also our model is condemned by his own people, led out of the city, and executed as somebody who has blasphemed the community's God, the God of the law, the God of the Jews, the God of the Gentiles, the gods of the Romans, are displaced by God in the flesh. And so ethnic identity, the law are made relative. And Christ then, or the personal, and Christ, being a part of the body of Christ, the personal relationship is made absolute.
Mm.
I think this is what Paul must mean when he talks about the displacement of the letter of the law. So love is, no longer dictated by the strictures of society, by the family, that we choose. And Illich talks a lot about the Good Samaritan, the story of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan and the Jew have this is a personal choice on the part of the Samaritan, that he goes into great detail in the way that Jesus tells this story. He says, it makes it possible for me to choose anywhere whom I will love, and thereby destroys and deeply threatens the basis for which ethics has always been ethnos, the historically given we which precedes any pronunciation of the word I. And so this new horizon of love, there's a freedom in it, but then there is the danger of institutionalizing it. He says the attempt to manage, to ensure, to guarantee this love by institutionalization, by submitting it to legislation and making it law, by protecting it through criminalization of its opposite, love made a duty, it converts it into just one more ethical norm rather than the unconditional love of the gospel. And so his point, he's defining sin. The way that we've defined sin in covenantal nomism, in so much of modern Christianity, is the breaking of a rule, the breaking of a law. His point is, no, sin in the New Testament is the betrayal of a relationship. This is Illich. Since that moment, since this possibility of a mode of existence was created, its breakage, its denial, infidelity, turning away, coldness has acquired a meaning it could not have formerly had. Sin as a divinely revealed possibility for man, he says, did not exist before this moment. And so where there was no freely, arbitrarily established love relationship, the gift given by the other, he says, which is founded on a glimmer of mutuality, you do not have the possibility of its denial. And so he describes this in very beautiful terms, but then he describes how the church institutionalizes it. And in institutionalizes it, betrays it. And he talks about hospitality. A lot of these things that the church makes its fortune, according to Illich, off of its becoming a charitable institution. He says, if you study the way in which the church created its economic base in late antiquity, you will see that by assuming the task of creating welfare institutions on behalf of the church or on behalf of the state, the church's claim to money and practically to unlimited amounts of money, because the task was unlimited, could be legally and morally funded. And so this regulated institutional charity inhibits then the original freedom of response, the personal response to the neighbor. This is Illich, something which Jesus told us about as a model of my personal freedom of choice. Who will be my other? And he's thinking here of the story of the Good Samaritan, is transformed into the use of power and money in order to provide a service. And so freedom and faith pass from the personal to institutional power. And he says, gradually, the power of the word made flesh is institutionalized. And Illich calls this the Antichrist. By the way, as far as I know, he always remained a Catholic priest, but of course, they were not happy with it.
Well, he at one point, in one interview, he said that the church is a whore, but she is also my mother, which is just the greatest line. And that's so Illich in a nutshell, right there.
Yeah. I've never, I don't know how he didn't stay in good stead with the powers.
No, he did not. He got in trouble all the time. Yeah.
But didn't, you would have thought, and at first I just assumed he was a former priest, but in fact he's not, I guess.
No, he was never defrocked or excommunicated or anything like that.
He says the idea that by not responding to you when you call upon my fidelity, I thereby personally offend God. And he's saying this is what Christianity is about. And the mystery, which he's talking about, the mystery of evil and the consequences of the perversion of faith throughout history, which he says is haunting the 20th century. And so he's describing this definition of sin as personal betrayal, definitive of sin. And then he's actually describing, and what I'm understanding him to be saying, that institutionalized Christianity is an institution of sin. In other words, it's taking the sinful idea, betrayal of the personal, and making that the very basis of its foundation. He says, or this is actually the guy interviewing him is David Cayley.
Yeah.
The new possibility of personally facing one another has produced as its perversion a vast architecture of impersonal institutions, all claiming in some sense to care. The vast engines that drive our world engines of education and health, as much as those of economic, technological development, all derive finally from a co-optation of the gospel's promise of freedom. David Cayley is he's the keeper of the Illich has died, and Cayley conducted these wonderful interviews with Illich.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Illich's point about an institutionalized faith, he traces this. And you're not going to bother me here if you challenge his history. I'm not a historian. I'm depending on his picture of this history. But he says that in 1075, when Pope Gregory VII, he issues the document, The Dictates of the Pope, and he assigns legal supremacy to the Pope over all Christians, and then legal supremacy of the clergy, who are the Pope's ambassadors, over secular authorities. And then he says the church transformed itself, he says, into a perfect society, an independent, legally constituted, bureaucratically organized state exercising a dominion of an entirely new kind over the lives of the faithful. What he's describing, I just found it so beautiful because, of course, what I see the New Testament as describing is the symbolic order, the law of sin and death is the thing that Christ frees us from and brings. And I think what he's describing for us is, but the problem of the law has been aggravated in the modern society and in an institutionalized Christianity.
Well, what happens within one generation of 1075?
Yeah.
The First Crusade is launched.
Oh, is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, 1095 is when the First Crusade was launched. 20 years later, one generation.
It's usually a good sign if you find your faith compelling you to kill other people. You may have something.
You may have got it wrong somewhere.
So he talks about farming innovations, that people actually, they needed to stay on their fields. But then they invented the horse harness, and they were able, for some reason, people began to go to villages, and then you have the village churches raised up. And then he says the supervision of the church intensified, and I know this may be offensive, and I don't mean it as offensive. He's a good Catholic, so I think well, good in quotes.
Not a good Catholic.
He says that the supervision of the church intensified, including regular private confession to a priest. And of course, I think prior to this, it may have been a public confession before the congregation. He says in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council proclaimed, every Christian will go under penalty of going to hell, otherwise a grievous sin, once a year to their own pastor and confess their sins. Now, whatever you might think about confession, and I think there's a good place for confession, you're going to go to hell if you don't go do this private confession. I'm not saying that people had to conceive of it and may not conceive of it in this way, but Illich's point is they came to see it in juridical terms. First of all, it's in secret. He talks about the priest, I guess, literally judging the nature of the sin in what he calls a new juridical act. And so both law and sin took on a new meaning. What is Paul's picture? I've been released from the law. I am no longer under law, but under grace. And now there is this intensification, according to Illich. For Paul, law was a denial of the freedom of grace. And with its transformation into a legal offense, Illich says that a new age began. This is the quote from him. The sense of sin of the first millennium becomes now a sense of sin as a transgression of a norm. And, this is the denial of grace in the New Testament, is a sin, not a legal offense, but it's always a personal offense. And now the sinner stands accused before a priest who judges her transgression of Christian law. He says grace becomes juridical. Sin acquires a second side, that of the breaking of the law, which implies that in the second millennium, the charity, the love of the New Testament has become the new law of the land. And at the same time, what's happening is the development of a new sense of human interiority. If you've lived in other cultures, you may get this sense. It's especially prevalent there in Japan. We always think about feeling guilty for sin. Japanese don't do that. I'm sorry. Well, that thing that we think must be universal, it's not universal. He says, not only was a juridical state structure created and sin was criminalized, made into something which could be dealt with along the lines of criminal justice, even if under self-accusation, and of course that's the key, the self-condemning self, but also the sense of a forum internal, or the person standing before the law of their own conscience. Actually, I think it's Cayley that references Hamlet's to be or not to be, followed by the reflection that conscience makes cowards of us all. Cayley says the new moral solitude, reflected there even in Shakespeare's Hamlet, plunges persons into the idea of this condemning personal conscience that the church is in, the installation of the kingdom of God as a legal regime on earth. The other thing, I won't go into this, I'm going way too long here, but he goes through marriage and talks about how marriage becomes itself a legal contract. And the family, of course, becomes the legal entity at the center of modern society. And God then is called upon in this legal arrangement as the witness, the instrument, he says, in the marriage. But here's this new legal reality, marriage, that becomes the center of a new, the new legal understanding of what a human being is. And he contrasts this throughout. If you go back to the original New Testament communities, they're gathering not as ethnic communities, not as in and through the law, but around the body of Christ. And he talks a lot about the giving of the kiss, the kiss of peace, and that there is this mutual breathing in of the Spirit. And then he describes the evolution of the kiss, this crude kissing of one another on the mouth. Well, then the priest begins to kiss the altar. In other words, it becomes literally instrumentalized. Interpersonal exchange becomes a purely symbolic exchange. He says by the 10th century, the mode of performing the ceremony, he calls this he describes the object that is used, an osculatorium. He says you can find these, a kissing object. And of course, they thought of this as the mutual sharing of the Spirit. You could have done, there are many things I think you could describe the institutionalization of the Eucharist, of baptism, of the Holy Kiss. But the point that Cayley is making, and I think Illich is making, is that this institutionalization of the Roman Church becomes then, this lays down the tracks for modern society. The rule of law, a law-based system. And in Illich's terms, after the Council of Trent, the fullness of this perversion is complete. He says, through the criminalization of love perverted, the basis was created for the new way of filling citizenship as a command of my conscience, for the possibility of the state to reclaim raison d'état as guideline for its legislation, which is obligatory in conscience. And of course, what he's describing is that feeling that people had in the church is transformed to their feeling as citizens, as patriots. And there is born then the nation state and the feeling of modern patriotism. I think clearly there is the development of an intensification. I think religion, Christianity gone bad, intensifies the problem of the law, intensifies the problem of the symbolic order. What we lose, or at least what is obscured to a large degree, is the depth of interpersonal friendship, the depth of love. Where we meet Christ is in and through one another. Where there is legalization, there is an obscuring of this personal relation, understanding. And so the apocalyptic is simultaneously a breaking in of a new order, but there is also the bad apocalyptic that is the perversion of this breaking in. I'll stop there.
I'm going to link really quick in the chat here. This is another from another David Cayley interview. Illich, in this one, he talks about the idolatry of life, which reduces life to a resource to be managed, and again takes us away from the personal element. It's also worth listening to. It's very good.
You, Nate, and others had kept recommending Ivan Illich to me.
Oh, I kind of assumed because of your leanings, I kind of figured that Illich was somebody that you were familiar with. I didn't realize that you hadn't run into him. Oh, well, yeah. He's right up your alley. You're going to love him.
Yeah, he agrees with me.
Exactly. He agrees with you on everything. Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, I just was so excited to find him.
Yeah.
And I know this could be offensive to people. I like his idea. Yeah, that the church is my mother, even if she's a whore.
Yeah, exactly.
I gotta use that sometime to a Roman Catholic priest.
I think in a sense, that's the position that many of us are put in.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what church you're a part of. Well,
right. Exactly. Exactly right. Yeah.
I can go to church nearly anywhere, and but obviously, if you can find like-minded people, but if you can't, you find fellowship where you can.
It's apocalypticism versus zombie apocalypticism.
Well, I thought that this depiction of it captured both the good I think the New Testament is apocalyptic, but I think the way that we perceive this word is also in the way that, the perversion of the apocalypse is the things gone bad. I think the apocalyptic includes both.
So actually, one of the more interesting things that I just to put a bug in here to maybe give Peter Thiel a chance, I did see an interesting conversation that Peter Thiel had where he was talking about the way in which Antichrist uses the fear of apocalypse as a weapon.
Mm.
Like apocalypse as the end of the in that end of the world sense is actually a tool that Antichrist uses in order to complete his trap.
How so? I'm not getting it.
Essentially, it's like the offer that Antichrist is that the spirit of Antichrist makes is to save you from apocalypse, and that's the trap.
I was assuming that J.D. Vance may be a reflection of his.
J.D. Vance definitely is like I don't. He definitely is under Thiel's influence, but not just Thiel though.
I know that this may seem dark to you, but in other words, I think what Illich is describing, and I guess that what I've been coming to is that the depth of darkness is to be found where there is no possibility of the light breaking in. That is a gospel perverted.
Yeah.
There is no gospel possibility.
Right, exactly. You have a perfectly rationalized closed system, and you think you have it all figured out and accounted for.
Forging Plowshares is a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom by providing in-depth, transformative biblical and theological education and discipleship. If you have found this podcast valuable, please remember to share on social media. If you have questions about what you've heard, or if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved with Forging Plowshares or even support this ministry financially, please visit our website, forgingplowshares.org.